The gates of Vienna held, barely. By early September of 1683, the Ottoman army that had marched north with the confidence of 100 years of victory found itself staring at walls it could not break, food it did not have, and a relief force gathering just beyond the hills it had failed to guard. Within days, the largest Muslim army Europe had seen in generations would be in full retreat, and the empire that sent it would never again come this close to the heart of the continent. Historians still argue about exactly when the Ottoman Empire began to fall. There is no single afternoon when 6 centuries of expansion quietly reversed. But if you ask most scholars of Ottoman history where the story of decline truly begins, not the slow administrative rot, not the corruption, not the wars that came after, many will point to one commander's decision outside one city in the summer of 1683. His name was Kara Mustafa Pasha, and the mistake he made at Vienna did not just cost a battle. It opened a door that Ottoman power spent the next 240 years trying and failing to close. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, Ottoman armies had already reached the gates of Vienna once before, in 1529, and pulled back only because of weather, supply lines, and time, not because a European army had beaten them in the field. Ottoman fleets controlled the eastern Mediterranean. Ottoman law, Ottoman administration, and Ottoman military organization were, by the standards of the era, extraordinarily effective. The empire stretched from the Balkans through Anatolia, across the Middle East, and along the North African coast. But by the late 1600s, something had shifted, and few people in Vienna, Istanbul, or anywhere else fully understood how much. Its treasury still commanded resources most European states could not match. What had changed was less visible. The pace of European military innovation had begun to outrun Ottoman adaptation. Standing armies in France and the Habsburg lands were being reorganized around new artillery doctrine, new infantry drill, and new systems of supply. The Ottomans had not stopped innovating, they had simply stopped innovating faster than everyone else, and in a contest between empires, relative speed matters more than absolute strength. Almost nobody in 1683 would have said the empire was in decline. That is important to sit with, because it is easy from centuries later to treat the fall of an empire as something that must have been obvious to the people living through it. It was not obvious. The Ottoman court that sent an army toward Vienna that year believed, with real historical justification, that it was continuing a tradition of conquest that had never seriously failed. The man leading that army had reason to believe the same thing about himself. Kara Mustafa Pasha had risen to the office of Grand Vizier, effectively the empire's chief minister and military commander, through a mix of talent, ambition, and one of the most important relationships in Ottoman politics, marriage into the family of a previous Grand Vizier, and years of proving himself administratively capable. By the time he took command of the campaign against the Habsburgs in 1683, he held enormous personal and political stakes in its success. This was not simply a war for the empire, it was, in a very real sense, a war for Kara Mustafa's own legacy. That distinction matters because it shapes almost every decision that follows. The campaign's official justification involved a rebellion in Hungary, Habsburg territorial pressure, and a request for Ottoman support from Hungarian nobles resisting Habsburg rule, genuine political grievances that gave the war a legal and diplomatic pretext under Ottoman custom. But the scale of the army Kara Mustafa assembled went well beyond what those immediate goals required. Ottoman and European sources describe a force in the range of well over 100,000 men, including regular troops, provincial levies, and allied forces such as Crimean Tatar cavalry, an army built not just to support a Hungarian uprising, but to strike directly at the Habsburg capital itself. This is where the first real fork in the story appears, and where historians begin distinguishing between what Ottoman military doctrine actually recommended and what Kara Mustafa chose to do instead. Ottoman strategic tradition, refined over generations of campaigning in Hungary, generally favored a methodical approach: secure fortresses along the route, protect supply lines, and avoid overextension deep into hostile territory before winter. Several Ottoman commanders and Hungarian allies reportedly urged exactly this kind of approach in 1683. Target the well-fortified city of Győr first, consolidate control over the surrounding region, and only then consider whether a strike at Vienna itself was worth the risk that late in the campaigning season. Kara Mustafa chose differently. He pushed the army past Győr and marched directly for Vienna. Why he made this choice is something historians reconstruct from the evidence available. not something we can know with certainty from inside his mind. But the historically supported explanation centers on ambition and timing. Taking Vienna, the symbolic heart of Habsburg power and one of the most prestigious cities in Christian Europe, would have been a triumph unmatched by any Ottoman commander since Suleiman himself. It would have cemented Kara Mustafa's position, secured his family's fortunes, and placed his name permanently beside the empire's greatest victories. A methodical, multi-year campaign to grind down fortress after fortress offered no comparable reward, and carried the risk that political rivals in Istanbul might use a slow campaign against him. It was a calculated gamble, weighed against personal and political stakes that had very little to do with what was actually best for the long-term security of the empire's western frontier. The army reached Vienna in mid-July of 1683 and began a siege that would last roughly 2 months. For the city's defenders, a garrison of perhaps 16,000 men under the command of Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, facing an Ottoman force many times that size, those 2 months were a slow, grinding catastrophe. Ottoman siege engineers were skilled in Ottoman mining tactics, tunneling beneath the walls to place explosive charges, steadily wore down Vienna's fortification. By late August and into early September, sections of the outer defenses had been breached repeatedly, and the city's supplies and manpower were running dangerously thin. Disease spread through the crowded, besieged population. Contemporary accounts describe a garrison stretched to the point of near collapse, with defenders uncertain whether they could survive another major assault. If Kara Mustafa had pressed a full, coordinated final assault in early September, several modern historians argue the city likely would have fallen. He did not. This is the second critical piece of the story, and it compounds the first mistake rather than standing apart from it. Kara Mustafa's siege strategy relied heavily on mining and gradual attrition rather than a single overwhelming assault, in part because he reportedly hoped to capture Vienna largely intact, preserving its wealth, its population as potential tribute or labor, and its symbolic value as a conquered capital rather than a ruined one. That preference for a controlled, valuable capture over a costly, destructive storm of the walls meant the Ottoman army kept probing and undermining Vienna's defenses rather than committing to the kind of decisive, high-casualty assault that might have ended the siege weeks earlier. Meanwhile, the choice to bypass Győr came due for its cost. Because that fortress remained in Habsburg hands, it functioned as a secure staging point for relief forces gathering from across Central Europe. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I had fled Vienna as the siege began, but he had not stopped working. Diplomatic efforts secured support from multiple German states and, critically, from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth under King John III Sobieski, whose forces would prove decisive. Ottoman scouting and intelligence about the approaching relief army has been criticized by later historians as inadequate for a siege of this scale and importance. Whether this reflects overconfidence, resource strain, or simple failure of reconnaissance is debated, but the practical result is not in dispute. When the relief army began crossing the Vienna woods on the 12th of September, Ottoman forces were not positioned to intercept or seriously delay them. What followed was one of the largest cavalry engagements in European history. Late in the afternoon of September 12th, King Sobieski personally led a massive charge of Allied cavalry, including the famous Polish winged hussars, down from the hills directly into the Ottoman camp. Combined with a coordinated assault from the city's exhausted but still fighting garrison, Kara Mustafa's forces did not simply lose a battle, they collapsed. The Ottoman camp, including a vast quantity of supplies, artillery, and treasure, was abandoned in the retreat. The siege that had come within what several historians describe as days, possibly even hours, of potentially succeeding, ended instead in a rout so complete that it became, almost immediately, a symbol across Europe of a turning tide. The consequences did not stop at Vienna's walls. Kara Mustafa retreated with the remnants of his army, and the political consequences at home were swift and severe by the standards of Ottoman court politics. He was blamed for the disaster, and in December of 1683, on the order of the Sultan, he was executed. A common, if brutal, fate for Ottoman commanders held responsible for catastrophic military failure. But removing Kara Mustafa did not undo what his campaign had set in motion. The defeat at Vienna triggered the formation of the Holy League, a coalition of European powers, the Habsburg monarchy, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Venice, and later Russia, explicitly organized to press the advantage against Ottoman territory while it was vulnerable. What followed was not a single war, but 15 years of sustained conflict across the Balkans and Hungary, a war the Ottoman Empire fought largely on the back foot, losing fortress after fortress that had taken generations to secure. That war ended in 1699 with the Treaty of Karlowitz, and this is the moment where the true scale of the one mistake becomes measurable in something more concrete than symbolism: territory. Under the treaty, the Ottoman Empire ceded the vast majority of Hungary, Transylvania, and Croatia to the Habsburgs, along with additional territory to Poland and Venice. It was the first time in the empire's history that it had been forced into a major treaty explicitly acknowledging significant territorial loss to European powers, rather than negotiating from a position of continued strength or rough parity. This is the pivot historians return to again and again. Ottoman expansion into Europe had, at times, paused. It had occasionally been checked, but Karlowitz marked something categorically different: a forced, formal, treaty-based reversal, negotiated from weakness. The empire that had spent nearly 3 centuries expanding into Europe now began the long process of contracting out of it. It would be historically dishonest to claim that a single siege or a single commander's decision to bypass one fortress and delay one assault single-handedly caused an empire that lasted until 1922 to eventually collapse. That would flatten 2.5 centuries of enormously complex political, economic, military, and social history into a single afternoon, and no serious historian argues for that kind of simple causality. The Ottoman Empire's later challenges involved administrative strain, the rise of nationalist movements within its territories, and eventually the pressures of industrial-age warfare that no early modern empire was built to withstand. But what historians of the period do argue, with substantial evidence, is something narrower and in some ways more unsettling: that 1683 marks the psychological and strategic hinge point. Before Vienna, the assumption embedded in Ottoman military planning and in the fears of Ottoman's European rivals was that the empire's westward momentum was, if not infinite, at least dominant. After Karlowitz, that assumption was gone, on both sides of the frontier. European powers began planning around the idea that Ottoman territory could be taken and held. Ottoman administrators began the long, difficult project of managing decline rather than managing expansion, a fundamentally different kind of statecraft that the empire's institutions had not been built for. Kara Mustafa's specific error was not ambition. Ambition had built the empire in the first place. His error was allowing personal and political stakes to override established strategic caution at exactly the moment those stakes mattered least, and the caution mattered most: bypassing a fortress that would have secured his flank, delaying an assault that could have ended the siege before help arrived, and underestimating how quickly a coalition of rivals could organize against a wounded but not yet defeated power. It is tempting, looking back, to imagine that a different decision outside Győr, or a faster assault in early September, could have changed everything. That Vienna might have fallen, the Holy League might never have formed, and the Ottoman Empire's slow 18th and 19th century retreat might never have begun, or might have begun on different terms, at a different pace. That is speculation, and honest history has to admit it as speculation. What is not speculation is this: the empire that marched toward Vienna in 16 years later knew, for the first time in its history, and that knowledge, more than any single treaty clause or lost province, is what one mistake outside one city's walls actually cost.